Hey guys, tonight we step into the glorious world of ancient Greece, a civilization famous for philosophy, democracy, legendary warriors, and a truly disturbing ability to ignore catastrophic physical pain. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In ancient Greece, the average person woke up every morning feeling like they had been personally folded by the gods during the night. Before sunrise, homes filled with the soft soundtrack of ancient suffering, coughing, groaning, stiff knees cracking, and someone muttering angrily while trying to stand upright. Not because they were especially old either. Ancient Greek life simply treated the human spine like a disposable item. Beds were not designed for comfort. Most people slept on rough woven mats, wooden frames, or sacks stuffed with straw that shifted into strange, painful lumps during the night. Pillows existed, but many had the structural elegance of a rock wrapped in fabric. If you woke up without neck pain, lower back pain, or a mysterious stabbing sensation in your shoulder, people probably assumed you came from money, or Olympus. And once you actually got up, things immediately became worse. Cities like Athens looked beautiful from a distance. White temples, marble statues, philosophers discussing wisdom beneath the sunlight. Very elegant. But at ground level, ancient Greece was mostly just rocks. Sharp rocks, hot rocks, slippery rocks. Entire hills made of rock specifically designed to attack human ankles. Most people walked everywhere in thin leather sandals that provided roughly the same foot support as politely asking the ground not to hurt you. Poorer citizens often went barefoot entirely, which meant cuts, bruises, cracked heels, splinters, and infections became part of daily life. Somewhere in Greece, an exhausted farmer probably stepped on the same sharp stone every morning for 20 years and simply accepted it as part of his personality. Farmers spent entire days bent over fields beneath the brutal Mediterranean sun. Fishermen dragged heavy nets while slipping across wet shorelines. Blacksmiths hammered metal beside blazing fires until their shoulders sounded like snapping branches every time they moved. And then there were the women, who somehow carried entire households on their backs, while history barely bothered writing their names down. Grinding grain with heavy stone tools slowly destroyed wrists, elbows, and shoulders over time. Hauling water jars from fountains required balancing enormous weight while walking through uneven streets in terrible footwear. Imagine carrying gallons of water uphill in sandals made from what appears to be disappointed leather. And despite all this, pain was considered normal. Nobody expected comfort. A sore back meant you worked. Cracked hands meant you contributed. Limping slightly at 35 was basically seen as maturity arriving early. In places like Sparta, complaining too much about pain probably earned you another reason to experience pain, because Spartan society looked at childhood and thought, what if we removed softness entirely and replaced it with spears? If there is one part of the human body ancient Greece absolutely neglected, abused, and emotionally betrayed, it was the teeth. Modern people panic when cold water touches a sensitive molar for half a second. Ancient Greeks lived with entire mouths that probably felt like active construction sites. One major problem was bread. Bread formed the foundation of daily diet across much of ancient Greece, especially for poorer citizens. But flour was ground using large stone mills, and tiny fragments of stone regularly mixed into the flour itself, which meant every meal came lightly seasoned with microscopic gravel. Over time, this slowly wore teeth down. Imagine sanding your own molars every single day for 40 years. That was essentially breakfast. By adulthood, many Greeks suffered from cracked teeth, exposed nerves, cavities, gum disease, and infections. Teeth darkened, chipped, loosened, or simply disappeared one by one like exhausted soldiers abandoning a battlefield. And unfortunately, sugar was not even the main villain yet. The real enemies were poor hygiene, coarse food, and the complete absence of modern dentistry. Toothbrushes as we know them did not exist. Some people cleaned their teeth with cloths, sticks, powders, or crushed charcoal mixtures. But most dental care was extremely limited. So if your tooth started hurting, there was a good chance it would continue hurting for months. or years, ancient Greek doctors did attempt treatments. Herbs, oils, vinegar rinses, and strange medicinal mixtures were commonly recommended. Some physicians believed certain worms caused tooth pain, because apparently human civilization has always enjoyed inventing terrifying explanations for medical problems. And if the pain became unbearable, there was always extraction, which meant somebody grabbed the tooth with metal tools or fingers and pulled until either the tooth came out or the patient spiritually left their body for a few moments. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, just raw determination and several nearby people holding you still while a man named Theodoros aggressively removed part of your skull situation. Even philosophers suffered from dental pain. Somewhere in Athens, an intellectual was probably discussing truth, morality, and the meaning of existence, while silently experiencing a massive abscess behind his left canine. Honestly, that may explain some of Greek philosophy, because after enough untreated tooth pain, you probably do start questioning reality itself. And yet, despite the constant discomfort, most people simply carried on. They worked, traded, argued in marketplaces, attended festivals, and debated politics while their mouths slowly deteriorated like ancient buildings beside the sea. Civilization, apparently, was built one aching molar at a time. Ancient Greece was breathtakingly beautiful. Unfortunately, it was also extremely committed to being uphill. Nearly every part of Greek life involved walking across rough terrain that seemed personally designed to punish human feet. Rocky paths, steep hills, loose gravel, uneven roads, burning sand, slippery harbour stones. The entire landscape felt like a challenge invented by someone who deeply hated ankles. And because carts and horses were expensive luxuries for most people, ordinary Greeks walked everywhere. In cities like Athens, streets were crowded, dusty, narrow, and filled with sharp debris. Outside the cities, conditions became even worse. Rural roads were often little more than dirt trails winding through rocky hillsides beneath the hot Mediterranean sun. Now add footwear to this situation. Most Greeks wore simple leather sandals with thin soles tied to the feet using straps. They looked elegant in statues. In reality, they provided roughly the same protection as placing optimism between your foot and a sharp rock. Poorer citizens sometimes went barefoot entirely, especially labourers and enslaved people, which meant cuts, bruises, splinters, cracked heels, and infections were simply accepted parts of life. Feet hardened over time into something halfway between human skin and ancient tree bark. And injuries happened constantly. Farmers stepped on thorns and sharp stones while working fields. Fishermen sliced their feet on shells and harbour rocks. Soldiers marched enormous distances carrying heavy armour that slowly crushed joints and blistered skin. Merchants crossed entire regions on foot with aching legs and swollen ankles. There was no concept of arch support, no cushioned insoles, no athletic recovery sandals advertised by a smiling retired athlete named Demetrios. If your feet hurt, society's official solution was essentially yes. The heat made everything worse. During summer, roads and stones became painfully hot beneath thin sandals. Dust stuck to sweat. Cuts became infected easily. Toenails cracked or fell off. Many older Greeks likely developed chronic foot deformities simply from years of walking across hostile terrain with terrible footwear. And yet foot pain barely deserved mention. A limping labourer still worked. A soldier with bleeding feet still marched. A fisherman with swollen ankles still hauled nets before sunrise. In places like Sparta, toughness was admired so intensely that complaining about foot pain probably just earned you more walking. Because nothing says strong society quite like emotionally suppressing the fact that your heel split open 3 miles ago. Still, despite the endless injuries, Greeks continued travelling, trading, fighting wars, building temples and climbing mountains. Which honestly becomes much more impressive once you realise they were doing all of it with feet that probably felt permanently on fire. One thing people rarely imagine about ancient Greece is the smell. Modern movies show shining marble temples, ocean breezes, olive groves, and clean sunlight pouring across elegant courtyards. Very cinematic, very peaceful. What they usually forget is that much of ancient Greek daily life smelled like smoke, sweat, fish, damp wool, and a medical emergency slowly developing indoors. Nearly every home relied on open fires for cooking, heating, and light. which meant smoke constantly filled houses, especially smaller homes with poor ventilation. Windows were tiny, chimneys were limited, and many kitchens were basically enclosed smoke chambers where people occasionally also prepared food. Imagine spending your entire life sitting beside a campfire inside a closet. Women, servants, and cooks suffered the worst effects because they spent the most time near the hearth. Every day they inhaled ash, soot, and smoke particles while preparing meals over open flames. Eyes burned constantly, throats became irritated. Chronic coughing was extremely common. By middle age, many people probably sounded like exhausted donkeys every time they laughed. And the fires themselves created additional dangers. Burns happened constantly. A pot tipped over, oil splashed. Someone reached too close to hot metal or burning wood. Minor burns were simply treated as part of household life, especially among poorer families. Meanwhile, workshops were somehow even worse. Blacksmiths inhaled smoke and metal particles while standing beside furnaces hot enough to make modern workplace safety inspectors faint instantly. Potters worked around kilns that filled the air with heat and dust. Tanners processed animal hides using chemicals and rotting organic material that produced smells powerful enough to spiritually damage nearby citizens. Then there were the harbour districts. In cities like Piraeus, the air mixed sea salt with fish waste, smoke from shipyards, sweating labourers, sewage, and rotting cargo left too long beneath the sun. Ancient ports were economically important and biologically aggressive, and despite all this, breathing problems were considered normal. If you coughed every morning, nobody panicked. If your chest burned after years beside cooking fires, people assumed that was simply what happened when you survived long enough. There was no clean indoor air, no air purifiers, no concerned doctor explaining long-term lung damage while holding a plastic model of your respiratory system. There was only smoke, constant smoke. Even philosophers discussing beauty and wisdom in Athens probably did so while inhaling enough soot to season a roasted goat. And somehow, civilization still moved forward through the coughing. In ancient Greece, being slightly hungry all the time was considered normal. Not dramatic famine-level hunger every single day, although that certainly happened during wars or bad harvests. More like a constant low-level emptiness quietly following you around while you worked under the sun, trying not to think too hard about roasted lamb you could not afford. Most ordinary Greeks ate simple meals. Bread, olives, onions, figs, lentils, watered-down wine, maybe some fish if you lived near the coast. Meat was rare for poorer citizens, and usually appeared during religious festivals, sacrifices, or those magical moments when somebody wealthier than you decided generosity sounded fashionable. A wealthy banquet in Athens might include roasted meats, honey cakes, wine, cheeses, and expensive imported foods. Meanwhile, a farmer nearby was emotionally bonding with another bowl of lentils. Again, food shortages were common enough that entire communities learned to endure hunger quietly. Droughts, storms, failed harvests, war, piracy, and interrupted trade routes could quickly create scarcity. Ancient economies were fragile. One bad season could push families dangerously close to starvation. And unfortunately, physical labour did not politely decrease during food shortages. Farmers still ploughed fields. Fishermen still hauled nets. Women still carried water and ground grain for hours. Soldiers still marched enormous distances while eating meals that looked less like nutrition and more like an apology from the government. Spartan society actually encouraged controlled hunger during military training. Boys in Sparta were intentionally underfed to toughen them psychologically and physically. They were even encouraged to steal food, but punished if caught, which is a fascinating educational philosophy. Starve the children slightly, then arrest them for reacting naturally. Many Greeks lived with stomach pain, dizziness, weakness, and exhaustion so regularly that they barely considered it unusual. Thin bodies were common. Food anxiety shaped everyday decisions. Families worried constantly about future harvests and storage supplies. And because refrigeration did not exist, food spoiled quickly. Grain could rot. Fish turned dangerous fast. Milk soured almost immediately in the heat. Sometimes people ate questionable food simply because the alternative was not eating at all, which meant stomach illnesses were common too. Honestly, ancient Greece spent a surprising amount of time either hungry, coughing, limping, or developing mysterious digestive problems. And yet, despite all this, People still gathered for festivals, argued about philosophy, performed theatre, and debated politics passionately. There is something deeply impressive about inventing democracy while running mostly on olives and determination. For all the daily discomforts of ancient Greece, the bad teeth, ruined backs, smoke-filled lungs, and permanently injured feet, there was one pain feared above all others: childbirth. Modern medicine has made people forget just how terrifying giving birth used to be. In ancient Greece, pregnancy was dangerous from the very beginning, and labour itself often became a brutal fight between life and death, conducted inside a small overheated room filled with panic, prayers, and several exhausted women yelling instructions at each other. There were no epidurals, no antibiotics, no emergency surgery waiting nearby, just endurance, herbal remedies, and hope that the gods were in a reasonable mood that day. Women usually gave birth at home surrounded by female relatives or midwives. Men were generally kept outside, which was probably wise considering many Greek men fainted dramatically at the sight of anything involving blood that was not happening in war. Labour could last for hours or even days. Mothers suffered tearing, bleeding, infections, exhaustion, and complications that modern hospitals now solve routinely. In ancient Greece, those same complications often became fatal, and everyone knew it. Pregnancy itself already caused enormous strain. Women carried water, cooked, cleaned, spun wool, wove fabric, and managed households while heavily pregnant because daily responsibilities did not magically disappear. Ancient society basically looked at pregnant women and said, "Congratulations, please continue carrying large jars uphill." After birth, recovery was often slow and painful. Many women suffered lifelong injuries afterward. Chronic back pain, internal damage, infections, and weakness became part of daily existence. Some mothers lost multiple children throughout their lives because infant mortality remained heartbreakingly common. Yet despite the suffering, childbirth was treated as an expected responsibility. Greek society admired maternal endurance, mainly because the entire civilization depended on women surviving experiences that would terrify even hardened soldiers. In places like Sparta, women were expected to produce strong future warriors while enduring pain with dignity and silence. Which sounds noble until you realize silence was usually expected because nobody particularly planned on helping very much. Ancient medical writers like Hippocrates documented pregnancy and childbirth in surprisingly detailed ways, but treatments remained limited. Some remedies helped slightly. Others sound like something invented during a fever dream involving olive oil and confusion. And somehow, through all the fear and suffering, women still raised families, maintained households, and kept society functioning. Honestly, ancient Greece owed far more to exhausted women than most Greek philosophers were willing to admit. In ancient Greece, injuries did not really heal the way we imagine today. They simply became part of you. A damaged knee became your permanent companion. A broken finger healed crooked forever. An old shoulder injury returned every winter like an angry relative who refuses to leave. Most people carried years of untreated pain inside their bodies while continuing daily life, because stopping to recover was usually not an option, especially if you were poor. Farmers still had fields to work. Fishermen still had nets to pull. Labourers still carried stones, wood, water, and cargo, regardless of whether their joints sounded like crushed pottery every time they moved. And injuries happened constantly. Construction workers fell from scaffolding, shepherds slipped across rocky hillsides, sailors were smashed against ships during storms, soldiers returned from campaigns with cuts, fractured bones, damaged backs, missing teeth, and scars covering entire limbs. Without modern surgery, many injuries healed badly, bones set unevenly. Deep wounds became infected, torn muscles never fully recovered. Some people limped for decades after accidents that modern medicine would solve in a few weeks. Others simply died from injuries that today would barely require a hospital visit. A deep cut could become infected terrifyingly fast. Even a small wound from a farming tool or sharp rock sometimes led to fever, swelling, and eventually death. Ancient people feared infection, because once it spread, there was often very little anyone could do besides pray, apply herbs, or stare nervously at the increasingly alarming colour of the wound. Greek doctors attempted treatments when possible, Some physicians cleaned wounds surprisingly carefully for the time period. Others cauterized injuries using heated metal, which technically stopped bleeding, while also creating an entirely new and exciting source of pain. Imagine seeking treatment for a leg injury and someone responds by bringing fire into the conversation. And then there were soldiers. In places like Sparta, wounded warriors were expected to endure pain without complaint. Scars became symbols of honor. Limping through the marketplace with an old battle injury could actually increase social respect, assuming you survived long enough to limp anywhere at all. But beneath the heroic image, many veterans likely lived with constant agony. Bad knees from marching, damaged shoulders from shields and spears, chronic pain from old fractures that never healed correctly. And yet society admired endurance more than comfort. Complaining too much about injuries risked making you appear weak, soft, or suspiciously interested in the idea of basic physical happiness, which ancient Greece generally considered an unrealistic hobby. If you lived in ancient Greece long enough, there was an excellent chance something else was also living inside you. Tiny invisible creatures, parasites, worms, stomach infections. The ancient digestive system was less of a functioning organ network and more of a crowded rental property with terrible management. Sanitation was limited. Clean drinking water was not always guaranteed. Food spoiled quickly beneath the Mediterranean heat, especially fish, milk, and meat. And because refrigeration did not exist, people often relied on salting, drying, or simply hoping for the best, which historically has never been a reliable food safety strategy. Stomach pain became part of ordinary life. Cramping, bloating, nausea, diarrhea, constipation. People experienced these problems constantly. Entire households probably spent evenings discussing philosophy while someone quietly suffered in the corner after eating slightly suspicious octopus earlier that afternoon. Parasites were especially common. Intestinal worms spread through contaminated food and water, and many people likely carried them for years without fully understanding what was happening. Ancient doctors described symptoms like weight loss, weakness, abdominal pain, and strange digestive problems with varying levels of accuracy and concern. Sometimes the treatments were sensible: herbs, dietary changes, fasting. Other times the treatments sounded like a man losing an argument with reality. Ancient medicine occasionally recommended bizarre mixtures involving vinegar, ashes, wine, oils, or substances that absolutely should not have entered the human body voluntarily. Somewhere in Athens, a patient was probably told to drink a foul herbal paste, while a physician nodded confidently despite having no idea what was happening internally. And honestly, confidence carried ancient medicine surprisingly far. Food poisoning was another common joy of daily life. Fish markets near the harbours could become dangerous quickly under the heat. Milk spoiled rapidly. Storage jars sometimes contaminated food. Bread developed mould. Olive oil occasionally went rancid. But people still ate because the alternative was starving gracefully. Even wealthy Greeks were not safe. Rich banquets featured large quantities of seafood, wine, cheese, and heavy foods consumed during long drinking parties called symposia, which meant elite citizens occasionally spent entire evenings debating logic and poetry, while their stomach quietly prepared a violent rebellion. And of course, nobody connected all illnesses properly. If your stomach hurt constantly, maybe it was bad food, maybe parasites, maybe disease, or maybe a god was angry because you skipped a sacrifice last month. Ancient Greeks genuinely lived in a world where diarrhea and divine punishment existed side by side as equally reasonable explanations, which honestly must have made self-diagnosis incredibly stressful. Modern gyms can already feel intimidating. Now imagine entering a place where everyone is naked, covered in olive oil, throwing each other into the dirt, and discussing philosophy between concussions. Welcome to the ancient Greek gymnasium. To the Greeks, physical fitness was deeply connected to honor, discipline, beauty, masculinity, and civic pride. Athletic training was not simply exercise. It was part of becoming a respected citizen, which sounds admirable until you realize many training routines were essentially organized bodily destruction, with a soundtrack of competitive yelling. Young men trained constantly in wrestling, running, boxing, discus throwing, javelin throwing, and combat sports. In cities like Athens, gymnasiums became major social centers where athletes, philosophers, and wealthy citizens gathered together, because apparently nothing stimulates intellectual conversation quite like watching someone get kicked in the ribs beside a sandpit. Athletes trained outdoors beneath the blazing Mediterranean sun. They rubbed olive oil across their skin before workouts, then coated themselves with dust or sand for grip. Afterwards, they scraped the mixture off using curved metal tools called strigils, which means ancient Greek hygiene involved marinating yourself like roasted vegetables before violently exercising, and the injuries were endless. Wrestlers dislocated shoulders and fingers regularly. Runners destroyed knees and ankles on rough terrain. Discus throwers strained backs and elbows. Boxers lost teeth, broke noses, and developed swollen ears from repeated impacts. Ancient boxing was especially brutal. There were no padded gloves. Fighters wrapped leather straps around their fists and punched each other directly in the face until someone collapsed, surrendered, or possibly began reconsidering the entire concept of athletics. Then there was pancration. Pancration combined boxing and wrestling into one terrifying sport where almost everything was allowed except biting and eye gouging. Kicking, choking, throwing, joint attacks, all perfectly acceptable. Spectators loved it, because humans apparently discovered mixed martial arts roughly 5 minutes after inventing civilization. Pain was expected. In fact, enduring pain publicly became part of athletic glory. Complaining too much made you appear weak. Bleeding during competition often increased admiration. Some athletes trained through severe injuries simply because stopping suggested softness. And despite the dangers, gymnasiums remained deeply respected places. Greek society admired the ideal of the strong, disciplined body almost obsessively, though honestly, after several years of ancient athletic training, many of those ideal bodies probably sounded like broken furniture whenever they stood up. Still, Greeks continued competing, training, and celebrating physical endurance because to them, suffering through effort proved character, or at the very least, extremely poor long-term joint preservation skills. In ancient Greece, one of the quickest ways to lose respect as a man was to complain too much about pain. You could have a fractured rib, a bleeding foot, a shoulder injury from military training, and what modern doctors would probably describe as concerning internal damage. But society still expected you to stand there calmly pretending everything was completely fine. Greek culture deeply admired endurance. Strength was not just physical, it was emotional. Men were expected to tolerate discomfort quietly, especially soldiers, athletes, labourers, and citizens trying very hard to look heroic in public. In places like Sparta, this mindset became almost extreme. Spartan boys began military training young through the agoge system, where hardship itself was treated like education. Hunger, cold, exhaustion, beatings, and physical punishment were considered useful tools for building character. The goal was to create disciplined warriors capable of enduring suffering without hesitation, or basic emotional stability. The boys wore minimal clothing even during cold weather. They slept on rough bedding made from reeds. Food was intentionally limited to encourage toughness and theft skills, which is a fascinating social policy when you think about it. Today's lesson, children, starvation and crime. And if a Spartan boy was caught stealing food, he was punished. Not for stealing, but for being caught. Ancient Sparta truly operated like a society designed entirely by exhausted military instructors. But even outside Sparta, Greek men faced enormous pressure to appear resilient. Soldiers marched long distances carrying heavy bronze armour beneath brutal heat. Rowers developed bleeding hands and ruined backs. Labourers worked through injuries because stopping meant lost income or starvation. Pain became proof of masculinity. Scars were admired. Endurance brought respect. Complaining too openly could make a man appear weak, overly emotional, or dangerously interested in personal comfort, which ancient Greece treated almost like a moral failure. Even philosophers praised self-control and discipline. Stoic endurance became part of the ideal male image long before Stoicism fully developed as a formal philosophy. A good man was expected to master discomfort rather than be ruled by it. Of course, this mindset also meant many men ignored serious injuries until they became catastrophic disasters. A damaged knee became permanent because treatment was delayed. A wound became infected because admitting pain felt shameful. Entire generations of Greek men probably limped around pretending everything was perfectly fine, while internally feeling like collapsed buildings. And honestly, modern men still do this. The main difference is that today they say things like, "I don't need a doctor," while sitting awkwardly after injuring themselves trying to lift furniture one time. Some traditions truly never die. If ancient Greek men were expected to endure pain bravely, women were expected to endure it silently and constantly. Daily life for women involved an endless cycle of physical labour that slowly wore down the body year after year. Cooking, weaving, carrying water, cleaning, grinding grain, raising children, preparing clothing, managing household storage. Nearly every task required repetitive, exhausting movement. There were no machines, no running water, no convenient little kitchen appliances designed to save time while making cheerful noises. Everything required effort. In many homes, women woke before sunrise to begin preparing bread using heavy grinding stones that damaged wrists, shoulders, and backs over decades. Archaeologists studying ancient skeletons often find severe joint wear among women, precisely because these tasks were repeated thousands upon thousands of times throughout life. Imagine developing permanent shoulder damage because your family wanted flour every day. Then there was water carrying. Most homes did not have direct water access, so women and girls regularly walked to fountains or wells, carrying heavy jars back through crowded streets beneath the Mediterranean heat. The jars could weigh an astonishing amount once filled. Entire generations of women basically trained like endurance athletes, without receiving any of the prestige or attractive statues afterward. And society largely treated this suffering as normal. Women also spent enormous amounts of time weaving cloth, which sounds peaceful until you realize it involved long hours in repetitive positions that destroyed the neck and spine. Fingers cramped, eyes strained in low light, backs stiffened from sitting hunched over looms for years. By middle age, many women probably felt physically exhausted before breakfast. Then came pregnancy and childbirth, often multiple times throughout life. Recovery periods were short because household responsibilities immediately returned. A woman could survive childbirth and then find herself carrying water again days later, because ancient society rarely paused to ask whether someone perhaps needed rest after nearly dying. Very inconsiderate system overall. In cities like Athens, respectable women were also expected to remain modest, disciplined, and emotionally controlled. Complaining too openly about suffering risked appearing weak, dramatic, or difficult, which is remarkable considering many were functioning while sleep-deprived, overworked, malnourished, and carrying chronic pain everywhere from their backs to their knees. And yet women kept households functioning entirely. Ancient Greek society loved praising male philosophers, politicians, and warriors, but quietly depended on exhausted women doing endless invisible labour behind the scenes. Honestly, if Greek civilization had been forced to survive 1 week without women managing daily life, the entire economy probably would have collapsed by Wednesday afternoon. When people in ancient Greece became seriously injured or sick, they eventually faced one terrifying possibility: medical treatment. Now, to be fair, Greek medicine was surprisingly advanced for its time. Physicians like Hippocrates observed symptoms carefully, recorded illnesses, and tried to understand the human body logically instead of blaming absolutely everything on angry gods throwing invisible tantrums from the sky, which already placed them several steps ahead of many later civilizations. Unfortunately, advanced for the time, still included procedures that would make modern patients sprint directly out of the hospital parking lot. Ancient Greek doctors treated wounds, fractures, fevers, infections, digestive illnesses, and injuries using a mixture of observation, herbal remedies, surgery, and alarming confidence. Some methods genuinely helped. Others felt more like punishments for becoming ill in the first place. Take cauterization, for example. If a wound bled too heavily or became infected, doctors sometimes burned the tissue using heated metal instruments. This stopped bleeding and killed infection, while also introducing the patient to several entirely new categories of suffering. Imagine arriving with a leg injury and someone calmly responding, "Excellent. Bring me the fire." Bone setting was equally unpleasant. Broken limbs were pulled, adjusted, wrapped tightly, and immobilized with wooden splints. Without anesthesia, patients remained fully awake while doctors manipulated fractured bones back into place. And because pain relief options were limited mostly to wine, herbs, or praying for unconsciousness, medical procedures often became endurance contests. Dental treatments were somehow worse. Rotting teeth were extracted using metal tools while patients were restrained by assistants or family members. No numbing agents, no sterile gloves. Just a sweating physician named Nicandros aggressively attempting to remove part of your skull while explaining that discomfort builds character. Surgery existed too. Ancient Greek surgeons drained abscesses, removed arrowheads, treated wounds from battle, and occasionally performed surprisingly complex operations. But infection remained a constant danger. A successful surgery could still kill you days later because bacteria had quietly entered the conversation uninvited. Even basic treatments looked suspicious. Doctors prescribed strange mixtures involving vinegar, olive oil, herbs, wine, honey, minerals, and occasionally substances that seemed chosen during moments of complete medical desperation. And yet, despite all this, Greek medicine laid important foundations for future medical science. Observation, diagnosis, and careful record-keeping slowly improved healthcare over time. Still, if you were an ordinary Greek citizen feeling unwell, there was always a real chance the cure might temporarily feel much worse than the disease itself. Which honestly remains true whenever someone mentions natural healing tea with too much enthusiasm. For ordinary citizens in ancient Greece, pain was part of life. For slaves, pain was often life itself. Behind the marble temples, philosophy, poetry, and democratic debates, Greek society depended heavily on slavery. Enslaved people worked in homes, farms, workshops, kitchens, ports, mines, and wealthy estates across the Greek world. Their labour supported the comfort of citizens who spent long afternoons discussing ethics, while someone nearby carried water with permanent back damage. Ancient civilizations always had a remarkable talent for separating human dignity from the humans doing the work. Household slaves cooked meals over smoky fires, cleaned endlessly, hauled supplies, cared for children, and performed physically exhausting tasks every day with little rest. Many slept on rough floors or cramped corners inside the homes they maintained, and because slaves were legally property, their suffering often mattered only when it reduced productivity. Farm labourers faced brutal conditions under the Mediterranean heat. They harvested crops for long hours, carried heavy loads, and worked through injuries because stopping usually was not their decision to make. A damaged back, infected cut, or swollen joints simply became part of surviving another season. But the worst suffering existed in the mines. Mining slaves lived inside something very close to hell. In places like the silver mines near Athens, enslaved workers crawled through narrow tunnels filled with dust, darkness, heat, and toxic air. They spent endless hours digging, carrying stone, and breathing particles that slowly destroyed their lungs. Injuries happened constantly. Cave-ins, crushed limbs, broken bones, exhaustion. Many miners died young, others survived long enough to become physically ruined. Imagine spending years underground, swinging tools in suffocating heat, while your entire society above ground celebrates philosophy and beauty. Even physical punishment itself was considered normal. Beatings, whippings, restraints, and harsh discipline were accepted parts of slave ownership throughout much of the Greek world. Some owners were less brutal than others, but slaves always lived beneath the threat of violence. And unlike citizens, they had almost no control over their own bodies, labour, or future. What makes this especially strange is that many Greek thinkers discussed justice, virtue, and morality in extraordinary detail. Philosophers debated the ideal society, while slavery quietly operated beside them like background furniture nobody wanted to examine too closely. Human beings are very talented at intellectual contradictions. Still, enslaved people endured unimaginable hardship while keeping households, farms, workshops, and economies functioning every single day. Ancient Greece is remembered for its great achievements, but many of those achievements were built on exhausted bodies carrying pain that history barely bothered recording at all. In ancient Greece, people did not need to reach old age to feel old. By modern standards, many citizens were physically exhausted before they even reached what we would consider middle age. Years of hard labour, poor nutrition, untreated injuries, smoke inhalation, disease, stress, and questionable medical decisions slowly wore the body down like waves eroding stone along the coast. By 40, many Greeks probably stood up with the sound effects of collapsing furniture. And honestly, 40 itself already counted as fairly mature in much of the ancient world. Life expectancy statistics are complicated because many people died young, but even those who survived childhood often carried decades of physical damage by the time they reached later adulthood. A farmer who had worked fields since childhood might already have chronic back pain, damaged knees, and arthritic hands before his beard fully turned grey. Fishermen developed stiff shoulders and swollen joints from years hauling nets. Labourers lost flexibility, strength, and teeth long before modern retirement age, which is unfortunate because retirement barely existed anyway. Most people continued working as long as their bodies physically allowed it. There were no pensions, no vacation homes by the sea, and definitely no ancient Greek commercials encouraging seniors to enjoy their golden years. Your golden years mostly involved surviving. Women experienced especially difficult aging, repeated pregnancies, childbirth injuries, grinding grain, hauling water, weaving, and maintaining households slowly damaged the body over time. By later adulthood, many women likely suffered chronic joint pain, weakened backs, and exhaustion that never fully disappeared. And then there were the eyes. Poor lighting, smoke exposure, aging, and years of detailed manual labour caused widespread vision problems. Imagine trying to thread a loom beside a smoky oil lamp, while your eyesight slowly betrays you one blurry stitch at a time. Hearing loss became common too, especially among blacksmiths, soldiers, sailors, and anyone who spent years around loud workshops or crowded public spaces. Though, honestly, partial hearing loss may have improved quality of life during certain political debates in Athens. Old injuries also returned constantly. A damaged shoulder from military service, a poorly healed fracture from youth, a knee ruined by decades walking mountain roads in terrible sandals, cold weather stiffened joints, scars pulled painfully during movement. Many older Greeks probably woke every morning, feeling like their skeleton had spent the night plotting revenge against them personally. And yet aging itself was often respected. Elders carried authority, wisdom, and experience. Society admired those who endured hardship long enough to survive into old age, which makes sense. In ancient Greece, reaching old age without becoming completely physically destroyed was honestly a remarkable athletic achievement. What feels strangest about ancient Greece is not how much pain people experienced, it is how normal they considered it. Modern life trains people to avoid discomfort constantly. If our back hurts, we buy a new chair. If our knee aches, we search symptoms online for 40 minutes and somehow convince ourselves we have a rare medieval bone disease. If the room temperature changes slightly, entire family arguments begin immediately. Ancient Greeks lived in a completely different mental world. Pain was expected. A sore body meant you worked. Scars meant you survived. Hunger meant life was difficult, which everyone already knew. Physical suffering was not viewed as some shocking interruption to existence. It was woven directly into existence itself. Part of this came from necessity. Ancient people simply lacked the tools to eliminate many sources of suffering. There were no antibiotics, painkillers, modern surgery, soft mattresses, refrigeration, or safe working conditions. Life involved physical hardship from childhood onward, so people adapted psychologically as much as physically. But culture mattered too. Greek society admired endurance deeply. Strength, discipline, and self-control became important virtues across much of the Greek world. In places like Sparta, toughness was practically treated like a religion. Citizens were raised to believe hardship built character and comfort weakened it, which sounds inspiring until you realize it mostly resulted in entire populations pretending their injuries did not exist. Even Greek philosophy reflected this mindset. Thinkers discussed moderation, discipline, emotional control, and endurance constantly. Philosophers argued that suffering could teach wisdom, strengthen the mind, or reveal virtue. Meanwhile, somewhere nearby, a fisherman with chronic back pain was probably thinking, I would personally prefer less wisdom. Religion also shaped attitudes toward pain. Many Greeks believed suffering could come from fate, divine will, bad luck, or simply the unavoidable nature of mortal life. Humans were temporary creatures living beneath unpredictable gods who occasionally solved disagreements by sending plagues, storms, or extremely symbolic birds, so pain became something to endure rather than eliminate. And somehow, despite all this suffering, ancient Greece still produced extraordinary beauty. Temples rose above cities, plays filled theatres, philosophers debated truth and justice, poets wrote about love and war, while ordinary citizens limped through marketplaces carrying water jars and untreated injuries. That may be the most remarkable thing about the ancient world. People were exhausted, hungry, injured, overworked, and constantly uncomfortable. Yet they still created civilizations that shaped human history forever, which honestly makes modern complaints about slow Wi-Fi feel slightly less dramatic. By the middle years of his reign, Henry VIII had become the kind of king who filled every room before he even entered it. People heard him coming long before they saw him. Servants rushing ahead, courtiers stiffening their posture, noblemen suddenly pretending they had always agreed with whatever Henry's latest opinion happened to be. In his younger years, he had been admired across Europe as the perfect Renaissance prince. Tall, athletic, educated, charming, and dangerously confident. He hunted for hours, wrote music, competed in tournaments, and carried himself like a man personally chosen by God to impress everyone within a 10-mile radius. And honestly, for a while, life had gone very well for him. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had once seemed almost ideal. Catherine was respected, intelligent, graceful, and politically experienced in ways Henry often underestimated. She came from powerful Spanish royalty and carried herself with calm dignity, even when surrounded by the chaos of the Tudor court, which was basically a beautifully decorated nest of gossiping snakes. Early in their marriage, Henry adored her. They rode together, celebrated together, and presented themselves as a united royal couple blessed by heaven itself. But royal marriages in the 16th century were not measured by love alone. They were measured by survival, and Catherine had failed to produce the one thing Henry believed England desperately needed: a healthy male heir. Pregnancy after pregnancy ended in tragedy. Some children were stillborn. Others died shortly after birth. Only one surviving child remained: the future Mary I. Henry cared for Mary, but to him, a daughter could not secure the Tudor dynasty. England's past civil wars still haunted noble families, and Henry feared the kingdom would collapse into another succession crisis after his death. At first he blamed bad luck, then age, then perhaps God himself. Soon Henry began convincing himself that his marriage was cursed because Catherine had once been married to his older brother, Arthur. Never mind that Henry had happily ignored this issue for nearly 20 years. Now suddenly it became a spiritual emergency of the highest importance. Convenient timing, really. And while Henry's frustrations grew heavier with every passing year, a young woman at court quietly entered his orbit. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and England would never be the same again. When Anne Boleyn first appeared at the Tudor court, she did not arrive like a woman planning to change the course of English history. In fact, compared to many noblewomen around her, Anne did not even fit the standard image of beauty at the time. She was not the pale, soft-spoken, courtly ornament poets usually praised. Foreign ambassadors described her as slender, sharp-eyed, dark-haired, and intensely expressive. Some thought she was attractive, others clearly did not. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing: she was impossible to ignore. Anne had spent years in the sophisticated courts of the Netherlands and France, where she learned music, fashion, languages, and the dangerous art of courtly charm. Unlike many English nobles, she understood how power moved through conversation, flirtation, and perception. She could dance elegantly, debate intelligently, and cut someone emotionally in half with a single carefully aimed comment while still technically smiling. Naturally, this made her extremely popular in the Tudor court, where emotional stability was already in critically short supply. At first, Henry VIII probably viewed Anne the same way he viewed many women at court, as another distraction. The king already had a history of affairs, and Anne's own sister, Mary Boleyn, had previously been one of Henry's mistresses. The expectation was simple. The king showed interest. The court quietly accepted it, and eventually everyone pretended not to notice. But Anne did something unexpected. She refused him. Not publicly, of course. Rejecting a king too directly was an excellent way to ruin your life very quickly, but Anne avoided becoming Henry's mistress, and that refusal fascinated him more than immediate surrender ever could. Henry was a man used to getting what he wanted: tournaments, Wealth, loyalty, praise, obedience. People spent entire careers telling him yes. Anne, meanwhile, remained cautious, distant, and just out of reach, which only made Henry pursue her harder. Soon he was sending Anne gifts, letters, and constant attention. His obsession grew so intense that he wrote passionate messages declaring his devotion, begging for her affection like a teenager who had just discovered poetry for the first time. Somewhere in England, exhausted royal advisors were probably staring into fireplaces, wondering how national stability had become dependent on one flirtatious conversation. But Anne understood something important. If she became merely another mistress, she would eventually be discarded. If she became queen, she could reshape everything. By the late 1520s, Henry VIII was no longer simply fascinated with Anne Boleyn. He was consumed by her. What had started as courtly flirtation had turned into obsession. And now Henry began convincing himself that his entire future, and England's future, depended on marrying Anne. There was just one enormous obstacle standing in the way. His current wife, Catherine of Aragon, had been Queen of England for nearly 20 years. She was respected by the public, admired by foreign courts, and deeply devoted to her role. Even many nobles who privately disliked her still acknowledged that Catherine behaved with remarkable dignity under pressure. Unfortunately for her, dignity mattered very little once Henry decided he wanted something else. And Henry wanted Anne, desperately. At first, the king tried to frame the situation as a matter of conscience. He claimed he had suddenly become deeply troubled by a biblical passage suggesting a man should not marry his brother's widow. This was slightly awkward, considering Henry had spent 2 decades enthusiastically being married to Catherine before developing this spiritual crisis immediately after falling in love with another woman. Still, Henry convinced himself that God had punished the marriage by denying him sons. Every miscarriage, every dead infant, every tragedy now became proof in his mind that the union had been cursed from the beginning. The king, who once praised Catherine publicly, now treated her more like a political inconvenience wrapped in expensive fabric. Meanwhile, Anne carefully encouraged Henry's hopes without fully surrendering to him. She understood the stakes. If Henry lost interest before securing the marriage, her position could collapse instantly. Tudor courts were ruthless places where yesterday's favourite could become tomorrow's forgotten embarrassment with terrifying speed. So Anne remained close enough to fuel Henry's obsession while distant enough to keep him chasing her. The king eventually decided he needed the marriage annulled. Simple enough in theory. Unfortunately, annulments for kings required approval from the Pope, and Europe at the time was tangled in politics, complicated enough to make modern office drama look refreshingly straightforward. The problem was that Catherine's nephew happened to be Charles V, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Pressuring the Pope to insult the Emperor's aunt was not exactly an easy diplomatic task, but Henry refused to let the matter go. England's king was now willing to challenge Rome itself for Anne Boleyn, and the entire kingdom was slowly beginning to realise just how dangerous that obsession had become. As Henry VIII pushed harder for an annulment, the atmosphere inside the Tudor court became increasingly poisonous. What had once been whispers behind embroidered sleeves slowly transformed into open factions. Noble families, church officials, foreign ambassadors, and servants carrying wine across palace corridors all understood the same thing. England's future now revolved around whether the king could marry Anne Boleyn, and people were choosing sides. Supporters of Catherine of Aragon viewed Anne as an ambitious intruder who had bewitched the king and humiliated a loyal queen. Catherine herself refused to quietly disappear. Even under enormous pressure, she insisted her marriage to Henry had been lawful and valid before God. She would not admit defeat, and she certainly would not agree to pretend that 20 years of marriage had suddenly become a clerical misunderstanding. The public admired her for that. Anne, meanwhile, became one of the most talked about women in England. Some courtiers praised her intelligence and elegance. Others absolutely despised her. Foreign diplomats described her with fascination mixed with alarm, as though England had somehow placed a lit candle next to a barrel of gunpowder and was now acting surprised about the smoke. The worst part was that Anne understood influence remarkably well. She encouraged scholars who supported religious reform, surrounded herself with educated thinkers, and positioned herself not merely as Henry's future wife, but as part of a broader transformation inside England. She was ambitious, politically aware, and far more involved in royal affairs than many women were expected to be. To admirers, this made her brilliant. To enemies, it made her terrifying, and Henry only grew more attached. He showered Anne with gifts, titles, and honours usually reserved for royalty. She travelled with near-queenly status long before any marriage officially happened. Court ceremonies increasingly centred around her presence, which deeply insulted Catherine and enraged many traditional nobles. Imagine serving a queen faithfully for 2 decades, only to watch the king parade his future replacement around the palace like an expensive new hunting hawk. Tensions reached dangerous levels during royal gatherings. Conversations became cautious. Alliances shifted constantly. One wrong opinion about Anne could destroy a career. But supporting her too openly could also become risky if Henry failed to secure the annulment. And despite years of effort, the Pope still refused to approve the divorce. For Henry, this delay became unbearable. He had spent years chasing Anne, fighting political battles, and humiliating his first queen. Yet Rome continued denying him what he wanted. So the king began considering something almost unthinkable. If the Pope would not grant him permission, perhaps England no longer needed the Pope at all. By the early 1530s, Henry VIII had stopped treating the annulment as a private marital problem. Now it had become a battle over authority itself. The Pope continued delaying, avoiding a direct decision that might anger either England or the powerful Charles V. But Henry had run out of patience. He believed God wanted him to marry Anne Boleyn, and Henry was not the kind of man who handled rejection gracefully, especially not from Italy. The king's advisers began searching for another solution. Among the most important was Thomas Cromwell, a sharp and ruthless political operator who understood something revolutionary. If Rome refused to free Henry from his marriage, England could simply reduce Rome's power altogether. It was an idea so massive that many people at the time could barely process it. For centuries, the Catholic Church had shaped nearly every part of English life. Religion was not just personal belief. It controlled marriages, burials, education, law, morality, and politics. Challenging papal authority was not like arguing with a local priest. It meant confronting the spiritual structure of Europe itself. Henry did it anyway. Step by step, Parliament passed laws weakening Rome's influence inside England. Church officials were pressured into obedience. Clergymen who opposed the king found themselves accused of disloyalty. Slowly, terrifyingly, Henry transformed loyalty to the crown into something almost sacred. And all of this chaos centred around one woman. Anne's enemies watched in disbelief as the king dismantled centuries of religious tradition because he refused to let her go. To many ordinary people, it felt unreal. England was being dragged into political and spiritual revolution because the king desperately wanted to marry a woman who would not settle for becoming his mistress. Meanwhile, Anne remained close beside Henry during the storm. She encouraged reform-minded thinkers and supported the circulation of religious ideas critical of Rome. This made her even more hated by conservative nobles and church leaders who increasingly viewed her as a dangerous influence corrupting the king's judgment. But Henry no longer cared what people thought. In secret, he and Anne had likely already begun living as husband and wife emotionally, if not officially. Then came the moment that changed everything forever. In early 1533, Anne became pregnant. Suddenly, the pressure exploded. Henry now needed the marriage legalised immediately before the child was born. If the baby arrived while Anne remained unofficial, the legitimacy of his desperately desired heir could be questioned. So Henry acted fast. He secretly married Anne Boleyn, broke fully from papal authority, and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. A king's obsession had now become a national revolution. After years of pursuit, political warfare, and religious upheaval, Anne Boleyn finally achieved what once seemed impossible. She became Queen of England. In the spring of 1533, the kingdom prepared for Anne's grand coronation in London. The ceremonies were magnificent, expensive, and carefully designed to send a message to everyone watching. The old order was over. Henry VIII intended the entire country, and all of Europe, to accept Anne not as a scandalous favourite, but as his rightful queen. Not everyone was convinced. Crowds gathered to watch Anne travel through London in glittering processions filled with banners, musicians, noblewomen, and elaborate displays of royal wealth. The streets were decorated, church bells rang, and official celebrations attempted to create an atmosphere of triumph. But beneath the spectacle lingered tension. Many people still loved Catherine of Aragon and saw Anne as the woman who destroyed a marriage blessed by God. Some spectators reportedly stayed silent as Anne passed. In Tudor England, silence could be louder than insults. Anne understood this better than anyone. She entered the coronation aware that half the kingdom admired her ambition, while the other half quietly hoped lightning might solve the situation permanently. Becoming queen had not ended the hostility surrounding her. In many ways, it had only intensified it. Still, the ceremony itself was extraordinary. Anne wore cloth of gold garments heavy enough to make walking feel like an advanced military exercise. Jewels glittered across her clothing, and her famous dark eyes remained fixed forward as she moved through Westminster Abbey toward the crown she had fought years to obtain. For Henry, this moment justified everything. The divorce, the split with Rome, the political chaos, the damaged alliances abroad. Anne was finally his wife and queen, and most importantly, she was pregnant. Henry became almost euphoric with anticipation. He convinced himself the long-awaited male heir was finally coming. Celebrations spread across court circles, and preparations quietly began for the arrival of a prince who would secure the Tudor dynasty forever. After all the years of frustration, arguments and spiritual crises conveniently timed around Anne's appearance, Henry believed God had finally rewarded him. But fate had a cruel sense of humour. In September 1533, Anne gave birth. The child was healthy. The child was strong. The child was a girl. Her name was Elizabeth I. Today, history remembers Elizabeth as one of England's greatest monarchs. But in that moment, inside Henry's court, her birth felt less like victory and more like the beginning of a very dangerous disappointment. At first, Henry VIII tried to hide his disappointment after the birth of Elizabeth I. Publicly, celebrations still took place. Cannons fired, church bells rang, and official announcements praised the healthy child born to Anne Boleyn. But everyone at court understood the uncomfortable truth sitting quietly behind the festivities. Henry had wanted a son, desperately. Anne likely believed another pregnancy would solve everything. After all, she was still young, still queen, and Henry remained emotionally attached to her. But Tudor queens existed under brutal expectations. Their safety depended heavily on producing male heirs, and affection inside royal marriages could disappear with terrifying speed once politics entered the room, especially when Henry was involved. The king who had once written Anne passionate love letters now slowly became colder and more impatient. The excitement of pursuit had faded. Anne was no longer the unreachable woman who fascinated him from across crowded halls. Now she was his wife, and more importantly in Henry's eyes, the woman responsible for securing the dynasty. Court life around Anne became increasingly hostile. Many nobles still supported Catherine of Aragon and her daughter, Mary I. They viewed Anne's marriage as illegitimate and quietly waited for her to fail. Every argument, every miscarriage rumour, every moment of tension between Anne and Henry spread through the court like wildfire. And Anne did not make herself easy to love politically. Unlike Catherine, who often projected calm dignity, Anne could be sharp-tempered, sarcastic, and openly confrontational. She argued with advisors, criticised powerful men, and occasionally challenged Henry himself. Unfortunately, challenging Henry was a little like arguing with a lion while standing inside its mouth. For a while, Henry tolerated it because he remained emotionally invested in her, but cracks were beginning to form. Then came more pregnancies, and more heartbreak. Anne suffered miscarriages that devastated both her physically and politically. One loss in particular deeply shook Henry because the child had reportedly been male. To the king, this began feeling horrifyingly familiar. Another marriage, another failed path toward the son he believed God owed him personally. Meanwhile, a new young woman quietly entered Henry's attention, Jane Seymour. Anne noticed immediately. The court noticed too. Suddenly, the same dangerous cycle that had once elevated Anne above Catherine began circling around Anne herself. Whispers spread through palace corridors, smiles became forced, loyalty became uncertain, and the woman Henry once tore England apart to marry slowly realised something terrifying. The king's obsession was starting to fade. By 1536, the atmosphere around Anne Boleyn had become dangerously unstable. The queen, who once dominated the court with confidence, now found herself surrounded by suspicion, enemies, and silence. Worst of all, Henry VIII no longer looked at her the same way. That was often the beginning of the end in Tudor England. Earlier that year, Anne suffered another devastating miscarriage. According to some reports, the child had been male. For Henry, this felt catastrophic. He had broken from Rome, humiliated a respected queen, and transformed England's entire religious structure, all for the promise of sons that still had not arrived. His patience collapsed quickly. At the same time, Henry's attention drifted toward Jane Seymour, a quiet noblewoman who seemed almost designed to contrast Anne in every possible way. Jane was soft-spoken, obedient and careful. After years of arguments and political storms surrounding Anne, Henry appeared exhausted. He no longer wanted excitement. He wanted peace, submission, and hopefully a healthy son. Anne understood the danger immediately. The problem was that once Henry emotionally abandoned someone, survival became difficult. Very difficult. Soon, powerful men at court, especially Thomas Cromwell, began turning against Anne. Cromwell had once helped elevate her position, but political alliances in Tudor England lasted roughly as long as milk left in the summer sun. Anne and Cromwell had increasingly disagreed over religion, money, and influence, and now Cromwell likely realised the king no longer wished to protect her. That made Anne vulnerable. Then came the accusations. Suddenly, Anne was charged with adultery, incest, and conspiracy against the king. Several men close to her, including musicians and courtiers, were arrested and accused of improper relationships with the queen. Most shocking of all was the accusation involving her own brother, George Boleyn. Modern historians overwhelmingly believe the charges were fabricated or wildly exaggerated. But truth mattered very little once Henry decided someone should disappear. Trials were held quickly. Confessions were extracted. Fear spread across court like poison. Anne defended herself fiercely, but the outcome had likely been decided long before the trial even began. One by one, the accused men were executed. Then Anne herself was condemned to death. The woman Henry had once pursued for years, the woman for whom he shattered England's relationship with Rome, now waited inside the Tower of London for execution. And the king who once wrote her desperate love letters was already preparing to marry someone else. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked toward the scaffold inside the Tower of London. Witnesses described her as calm, composed, even strangely graceful considering the circumstances. Only a few years earlier, she had stood crowned beside Henry VIII as Queen of England. Now she was surrounded by guards, awaiting execution ordered by the very man who once destroyed kingdoms for her affection. Tudor romance had a remarkable talent for ending catastrophically. Anne spoke carefully before her death, avoiding direct criticism of Henry. Publicly blaming the king would have endangered anyone connected to her, including her family and supporters. Instead, she declared herself prepared to die and prayed for the king's future. Then, with terrifying efficiency, the execution was carried out by a skilled French swordsman brought specially for the occasion. Anne Boleyn was dead at around 35 years old, and Henry moved on with astonishing speed. Less than 2 weeks later, he married Jane Seymour. To many observers, the transition felt almost inhumanly cold. The years-long obsession, the love letters, the political revolution, the destruction of his first marriage. All of it seemed to vanish the moment Anne stopped being useful to him. But even though Anne died, the consequences of Henry's obsession could not be undone. England had permanently broken from the authority of Rome. The Church of England now existed under royal control. Monasteries would soon be dissolved, religious wealth redistributed, and centuries of Catholic influence violently transformed. Political power inside England shifted forever because one king refused to abandon his pursuit of one woman. Ironically, the child Henry initially viewed as a disappointment would become Anne's greatest legacy. Elizabeth I eventually rose to the throne and became one of the most powerful and successful monarchs in English history. Under Elizabeth, England entered a golden age of exploration, literature, and growing international power. The daughter Henry once desperately wished had been born male ultimately proved far more capable than many princes of her era. As for Henry, his obsession with Anne revealed something deeper about him. He was charismatic, intelligent, and capable of enormous vision, but also dangerously selfish, impulsive, and unable to separate personal desire from national policy. What began as infatuation eventually consumed marriages, friendships, religion, and lives. Anne Boleyn remains one of history's most debated queens because she stood at the centre of a moment where personal passion reshaped an entire nation. A king wanted her love. England paid the price. In a medieval town, there were few objects more unsettling than the barber's chair. It sat near the front of the shop, usually made of heavy wood, surrounded by razors, cloths, bowls, knives, and metal tools that looked alarmingly similar regardless of whether the day's task involved trimming a beard or removing a tooth. A customer entering the shop might hope for a quick haircut and pleasant gossip. Unfortunately, the man sitting in that same chair an hour earlier may have been screaming while having an infected molar yanked out with iron forceps. Welcome to medieval healthcare. The medieval barber was one of the strangest professions in daily life, because his job seemed to expand every time society encountered a new problem nobody else wanted to handle. Haircuts? Of course. Beard trimming? Naturally. But over time, barbers also became surgeons, bloodletters, wound cleaners, bone setters, and dentists. Basically, if something on your body needed cutting, draining, pulling, or aggressively poking with sharp metal objects, the barber was probably involved. And somehow this became normal. Part of the reason was simple practicality. Highly educated physicians existed, but they were expensive and often focused on wealthy nobles, bishops, or kings. Many university-trained doctors preferred studying ancient medical texts, written by Greek and Roman scholars, rather than touching filthy wounds directly themselves. Blood, infection, and physical labour were considered lower status work. So while physicians debated theories in Latin, barbers were downstairs actually sawing into somebody's swollen leg. Not always successfully, unfortunately. Barber shops became centres of daily life in towns and cities. Men gathered there not only for grooming, but for conversation, rumours, politics, and news. The barber often knew everything happening locally because eventually everyone ended up in his chair. Weddings, deaths, affairs, business disputes, stolen chickens. The barber probably heard about all of it while sharpening a razor dangerously close to someone's throat. The most famous symbol of the profession still survives today: the red and white barber pole. Its origins likely came from bloodletting, one of the barber's most common medical services. Red symbolised blood, white represented bandages, and the pole itself may have represented the stick patient squeezed during the procedure, which means the cheerful spinning decoration outside modern barber shops is partially descended from medieval blood removal. History truly does find creative ways to remain uncomfortable. And for medieval people, the barber's chair represented something deeply unsettling. The strange place where grooming, pain, medicine, and survival all blended together under one roof. Of all the services medieval barbers provided, none was more common, or more horrifyingly overused, than bloodletting. If a person had headaches, fever, stomach pain, dizziness, sadness, swollen limbs, or simply looked vaguely unhealthy, there was an excellent chance somebody would eventually recommend removing some of their blood. Medieval medicine believed the human body depended on balancing 4 bodily humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these humours supposedly fell out of balance, illness appeared. And naturally, the solution was often to start draining people like damaged wine barrels. The barber surgeon usually performed bloodletting using sharp blades or specialised tools called lancets. Patients sat in the barber's chair gripping a wooden rod, while veins were opened to release blood into bowls nearby. The amount removed depended on the illness, the season, the patient's age, and occasionally what phase the moon happened to be in, because medieval medicine loved adding astrology into already questionable medical decisions. Sometimes the procedure genuinely helped a little. In rare cases, reducing blood pressure or draining infected swelling may have offered temporary relief, but far more often, people simply became weaker, paler, and increasingly aware that their treatment involved slowly leaking onto the floor, while a man who also trimmed beards nodded confidently nearby. Barbers performed bloodletting constantly because people truly believed in it. Kings used it. Monks used it. Peasants used it. Entire monasteries scheduled regular bloodletting sessions, almost like uncomfortable medical holidays. There were even calendars advising the best days for bleeding different body parts. Medieval society looked at the human body and somehow concluded that excessive internal blood was humanity's greatest enemy. This created a slightly unfortunate cycle. A sick person weakened by infection might lose blood during treatment, grow even weaker afterward, and then be diagnosed as needing further treatment because they now looked terrible. At that point, more bloodletting might be recommended. Medieval medicine occasionally resembled a group project where everyone confidently made the situation worse together. Still, barber surgeons gained enormous importance because they actually interacted physically with patients. While learned physicians often prescribed treatments from a distance, barbers handled the messy reality directly. They cleaned wounds, stitched cuts, applied poultices, and dealt with injuries caused by fights, farming accidents, bad horses, and medieval warfare, which produced injuries at industrial levels. And despite the danger, people kept returning. Because in a world without antibiotics, modern hospitals, or scientific understanding of infection, the barber represented one of the few people willing to try something, even if that something occasionally involved removing enough blood to make the original illness seem like the safer option. If there was one moment guaranteed to fill medieval people with dread, it was hearing the barber calmly say, "This tooth will have to come out." Modern dentistry already makes many people nervous, but medieval dentistry operated on an entirely different level of suffering. There were no anesthetics worthy of the name, no sterile tools, no understanding of bacteria, and certainly no reassuring dentist explaining procedures with soothing pamphlets and soft background music. Medieval dental care mostly consisted of enduring pain until the situation became unbearable, at which point a barber surgeon would attempt to solve the problem using force, prayer, and whatever rusty metal instrument happened to be nearby. Naturally, this sometimes ended badly. Tooth problems were incredibly common in medieval life. Diets heavy in coarse bread, ale, and sugary foods among the wealthy slowly damaged teeth over time. Poor dental hygiene made things worse. Toothaches, infections, rotting gums and abscesses could become agonizing or even deadly if infections spread deeper into the body. Unfortunately, medieval medicine had very limited ways to treat dental disease beyond removing the offending tooth entirely, so people ended up in the barber's chair. The procedure itself was brutally simple. The barber used iron forceps called tooth pelicans or dental keys to grip the damaged tooth before pulling, twisting, and sometimes violently wrenching it free. Ideally, the tooth came out quickly. Less ideally, it shattered halfway through, leaving fragments behind while the patient experienced what can only be described as spiritual character development. And because pain relief barely existed, patients often drank large amounts of alcohol beforehand. Ale, wine, or strong liquor became the closest thing medieval Europe had to anesthesia, which meant some procedures involved an intoxicated patient being restrained in a crowded barber shop, while a barber attempted precision dental extraction, surrounded by people casually discussing local gossip nearby. Not exactly the calm, clinical environment modern medicine strives for. Sometimes barbers also attempted strange remedies before extraction. Herbs, oils, burnt mixtures, and heated instruments might be applied to aching teeth. In some places, people believed worms caused tooth decay, leading practitioners to recommend bizarre treatments intended to draw out invisible creatures supposedly living inside the mouth. Medieval understanding of dentistry occasionally wandered into territory that sounded less medical and more like someone losing an argument with reality. Yet despite the pain and risks, barber surgeons remained essential. A severe tooth infection could kill a person slowly and horribly. Extraction, terrifying as it was, often gave people their best chance at survival, which meant medieval patients kept returning to the same unsettling chair where haircuts, surgery, and tooth removal all somehow coexisted under one roof. As medieval towns grew larger and wars became more frequent, barber surgeons found themselves performing increasingly serious medical procedures. What began as simple grooming and bloodletting slowly expanded into minor surgery, wound treatment, and emergency care. In many places, if you were stabbed in a tavern fight, crushed by a horse, or split open during battle, the barber was the person most likely to deal with the aftermath, which was comforting in the same way a leaking boat is comforting during a storm. Professional physicians often avoided surgery because cutting into the body was considered low status, dirty work. Universities focused more on theory than practical anatomy, and many educated doctors preferred diagnosing illnesses while standing safely away from blood and infection. Barber surgeons, meanwhile, worked directly with sharp tools every day, and had far fewer concerns about ruining expensive robes with bodily fluids, so they became medieval Europe's unofficial emergency room staff. Inside barbershops, patients arrived with deep cuts, broken bones, infected wounds, boils, arrow injuries, and injuries caused by medieval labour, which was essentially a non-stop partnership between humans and dangerous heavy objects. Farmers crushed limbs beneath carts, blacksmiths burned themselves, labourers split skin with tools, and soldiers returned from war carrying injuries horrific enough to make even experienced barbers pause briefly before pretending confidence. The procedures themselves were painful and risky. Without anaesthesia, patients had to be restrained or physically held down during operations. Speed became one of the barber's most valuable skills. A fast amputation, for example, could mean the difference between survival and dying from shock during the procedure itself. Unfortunately, surviving the surgery only introduced the next danger: infection. And medieval infection was ruthless. Barber surgeons had little understanding of germs or sterilization. Instruments were reused repeatedly with minimal cleaning. Bandages were basic. Operating environments were crowded and dirty. A successful surgery could still end in death days later when wounds became infected. Many patients developed fevers, gangrene, or blood poisoning after procedures that initially appeared successful. Still, barber surgeons earned respect because they actually acted when action was needed. They stitched wounds, cauterized bleeding with hot irons, drained abscesses, and treated battlefield injuries that physicians often avoided entirely. During wars, barber surgeons travelled with armies and became essential for keeping soldiers alive long enough to continue fighting, or at least alive long enough to complain loudly about the experience. Over time, some barber surgeons became genuinely skilled through experience alone. Repetition taught them practical anatomy better than many educated scholars possessed. They learned which wounds killed quickly, which bones could heal, and which procedures occasionally worked. The problem was that medieval medicine still relied heavily on luck, and luck was not always available inside the barber's chair. For medieval people, the barber shop was not just a place for grooming or medical treatment. It was also one of the busiest social spaces in town. Long before newspapers, radios, or social media existed, information travelled through conversations, rumours, arguments, and half-drunk storytelling sessions inside crowded public spaces, and few places gathered more people than the local barber shop, which meant the barber usually knew absolutely everything. Men visited regularly for beard trimming, haircuts, bloodletting appointments, and minor medical care. While waiting their turn, customers talked endlessly about taxes, wars, marriages, scandals, crimes, harvests, local politics, and neighbours behaving suspiciously near goats after sunset. Merchants exchanged business rumours. Soldiers exaggerated battlefield stories. Priests quietly listened for moral disasters, and travellers carried news from distant towns. The barber stood in the middle of it all, holding a razor dangerously close to someone's throat. Unlike nobles or priests, barbers interacted with nearly every social class. Wealthy merchants, labourers, farmers, guards, craftsmen, monks, and wandering travellers all eventually sat in the same chair. This gave barbers unusual influence because they became collectors of information. A skilled barber learned when to speak, when to flatter, and when to pretend not to hear things that could accidentally get someone arrested. Because medieval gossip was not always harmless entertainment, rumours could destroy reputations, trigger feuds, or attract dangerous attention from local authorities. A careless accusation of theft, heresy, adultery, or disloyalty could ruin lives. Barbershops therefore became places where conversation balanced constantly between humour and danger. One customer might laugh about a drunken noble embarrassing himself at a feast, while another quietly lowered his voice to discuss rising taxes or dissatisfaction with local rulers. And the barber heard all of it while trimming sideburns. The atmosphere inside these shops could shift rapidly. During peaceful times, barber shops felt lively and communal. Men joked, debated sports-like tournament results, and argued over politics with the confidence of people who had absolutely no control over politics whatsoever. But during times of plague, famine, or war, conversations became darker. Fear spread quickly in crowded spaces, and barbershops often became centres for discussing disasters before official announcements even reached the town. Barbers themselves sometimes acted almost like informal therapists. Customers complained about wives, debts, injuries, bad luck, and daily frustrations, while the barber nodded sympathetically and prepared instruments that looked increasingly alarming the longer one stared at them. In a strange way, barbershops reflected medieval society itself. Noisy, crowded, uncomfortable, deeply human, and always existing one bad decision away from chaos. And somehow, despite the blood, screams, and occasional tooth extractions happening nearby, people kept coming back every week. If medieval barber surgeons gained experience anywhere faster than in town shops, it was on the battlefield. War in the Middle Ages produced injuries on a horrifying scale, and armies desperately needed men capable of treating wounds quickly. So barber surgeons travelled alongside soldiers carrying razors, saws, knives, needles, bandages, and enough grim confidence to face scenes most ordinary people could barely imagine. Because medieval warfare was not clean. Battles were loud, chaotic massacres fought at terrifyingly close distances. Swords split flesh, arrows pierced armour gaps, axes crushed bones, and horses trampled wounded men into mud already soaked with blood. Surviving the battle itself was often only the first challenge. Afterward came infection, fever, and the slow realization that the man examining your wound also happened to cut hair professionally. The battlefield barber surgeon worked under brutal conditions. There were no clean operating rooms or quiet recovery spaces. Procedures happened inside tents, monasteries, castles, or directly beside battlefields surrounded by screaming injured soldiers. The smell alone was overwhelming. Blood, sweat, mud, smoke, rot, and infection blending into something unforgettable in the worst possible way. And still, the barber had to keep working. Amputations became one of the most common emergency procedures during war. Limbs shattered by weapons often could not heal properly, especially once infection set in. The barber surgeon would use knives and bone saws to remove damaged arms or legs as quickly as possible. Speed mattered enormously because pain and shock could kill patients during the operation itself. There was no real anesthesia. At best, soldiers drank strong alcohol beforehand or bit down on leather straps while several men held them still. Imagine hearing the sound of a saw cutting through bone while trying not to move, because movement might make the entire situation worse somehow. Medieval warfare truly had an extraordinary ability to redefine the concept of bad day. Cauterization was also common. Hot irons were pressed against wounds to stop bleeding, creating smoke, terrible smells, and pain so intense some patients reportedly lost consciousness. Ironically, fainting was sometimes the closest thing available to merciful pain relief. Despite all this brutality, experienced barber surgeons occasionally became highly respected figures within armies. A skilled one could save lives others would lose. They learned from repetition, observing which wounds healed, and which almost always proved fatal. Some even developed surprisingly advanced techniques for stitching injuries or cleaning wounds compared to the standards of the time. But survival remained uncertain. For many medieval soldiers, the barber surgeon represented both hope and terror simultaneously. The man most likely to save your life, and also the man most likely to approach you carrying a bone saw. Although medieval barber surgeons gained real practical experience treating wounds and injuries, much of the medicine surrounding them remained deeply strange by modern standards. Medieval people desperately wanted explanations for disease, pain, and suffering, but without scientific understanding, many treatments drifted into a bizarre mixture of ancient theory, superstition, religion, and pure, hopeful improvisation. And unfortunately, the human body paid the price. barber surgeons often worked alongside beliefs that now sound completely absurd. Illness might be blamed on unbalanced humours, bad air, sinful behaviour, planetary alignment, or invisible spiritual corruption. A fever could lead to bloodletting. A headache might inspire herbal mixtures, strange diets, or hot metal instruments applied somewhere alarming. Toothaches were sometimes blamed on imaginary worms living inside the teeth, because apparently medieval society looked at dental pain and concluded tiny underground monsters were the logical answer. To be fair, without microscopes or germ theory, people were trying to understand an incredibly complicated problem with almost no reliable tools. Still, some remedies became astonishingly questionable. Animal fat, crushed herbs, vinegar, urine, wine, honey, and even ground minerals appeared in medieval treatments. Certain mixtures may actually have helped slightly. Honey, for example, has natural antibacterial qualities, but many others likely did nothing beyond making the patient smell increasingly concerning. Barber surgeons also used poultices placed over wounds to draw out illness, though sometimes these applications simply trapped infection more effectively. And then there was cauterization. Few medieval medical practices sounded more horrifying than deliberately burning flesh with heated metal. Barber surgeons used red-hot irons to stop bleeding, close wounds, or supposedly destroy infection. The process was agonizing and smelled terrible, creating scenes that likely convinced many patients to reconsider whether survival was truly worth this level of suffering. But perhaps the most dangerous part of medieval medicine was confidence. Barber surgeons often projected certainty because patients expected authority. Even when treatments failed repeatedly, medical traditions continued for centuries because there were few better alternatives available. If a patient survived, the treatment received credit. If the patient died, the illness was blamed. Medieval healthcare occasionally operated with the scientific rigor of someone aggressively guessing during an emergency. And yet, strangely enough, not all medieval remedies were useless. Some barber surgeons accidentally stumbled into effective practices through observation and experience. Cleaning wounds with wine or vinegar sometimes reduced infection slightly. Keeping injuries bandaged protected them from dirt. Certain herbal mixtures reduced swelling or eased pain. Practical experience occasionally pushed medieval medicine forward, despite the chaos surrounding it. Still, walking into a barber shop with a serious illness remained deeply risky, because while the barber might genuinely help you, there was also a very real possibility he was about to treat your fever using astrology, leeches, and a heated iron rod. As the medieval world slowly changed, barber surgeons found themselves caught between two identities. On one hand, they were practical workers who actually touched patients, cleaned wounds, pulled teeth, and performed surgeries ordinary physicians often refused to handle. On the other hand, educated medical scholars increasingly viewed them as rough craftsmen rather than true medical professionals, which must have felt slightly insulting after amputating someone's leg at sunrise. For centuries, barber surgeons occupied an awkward but essential place in society. They learned through apprenticeship rather than universities, meaning their knowledge came from repetition and experience instead of formal academic study. A young apprentice might spend years sharpening razors, mixing treatments, cleaning instruments, and assisting during procedures before eventually practicing himself. Sometimes this created genuinely skilled practitioners. Other times it created men with dangerous confidence and access to saws. As towns grew wealthier and universities expanded, medicine slowly became more organized. Physicians began pushing for stricter professional standards and greater separation between educated medicine and manual surgery. Surgery itself gradually became more respected as people recognized the importance of anatomy and hands-on treatment. Ironically, the very work barber surgeons helped normalize eventually contributed to their decline. Because once surgery became prestigious, educated physicians wanted control over it. In several parts of Europe, governments and medical guilds started regulating who could perform operations. Barber guilds formed official rules, examinations, and licensing systems to improve standards. In some cities, barber surgeons were divided into separate categories depending on whether they mainly cut hair or practiced surgery. Authorities increasingly worried about untrained practitioners causing disasters, which, given medieval medical history, was probably a reasonable concern. England eventually became one of the most famous examples. In the 16th century, barbers and surgeons were formally united under the Company of Barber Surgeons. The profession even received official recognition from Henry VIII. However, over time, surgeons pushed harder to distance themselves from ordinary barbers entirely. They wanted medicine to become a respected science rather than something associated with beard trimming and public tooth extractions. Honestly, fair enough. By the 18th century, the separation became more complete. Surgery evolved into its own specialised profession, while barbers returned primarily to grooming work. The terrifying all-purpose medieval barber slowly disappeared, replaced by clearer distinctions between doctors, dentists, surgeons, and hairdressers. Probably a wise development for humanity overall. Yet traces of the old profession survived. The barber pole remained. Traditional shaving rituals remained. Even the language surrounding surgery and anatomy carried echoes of those earlier centuries when medicine was still raw, improvised, and dangerously experimental. And behind it all lingered the strange memory of a time when one man could shave your beard in the morning and amputate your leg before dinner. Today, walking into a modern barbershop feels ordinary. You expect clean mirrors, clippers buzzing softly, maybe some music playing in the background, and a conversation about sports or weather while someone trims your hair. Rarely does anyone enter expecting emergency surgery or the sudden loss of a tooth. Medieval people did not enjoy that luxury. For centuries, the barber's chair represented one of the strangest intersections in everyday life. A place where grooming, medicine, pain, gossip, and survival all existed together. Medieval barber surgeons operated in a world without antibiotics, anesthesia, sterilization, or scientific understanding of disease. Yet despite those limitations, society depended heavily on them, because almost nobody else was willing or able to handle the physical realities of injury and illness directly. And physical realities were everywhere in medieval life. People worked dangerous jobs with primitive tools, fought brutal wars, rode unpredictable horses, cooked over open flames, and lived in crowded towns vulnerable to infection. Broken bones, infected wounds, rotting teeth, and violent injuries were common experiences. In that harsh environment, barber surgeons became essential, not because they were perfect healers, but because they were available. They tried. Sometimes that effort genuinely saved lives. Experienced barber surgeons learned practical anatomy through repetition long before modern medical schools standardized surgical training. They stitched wounds, drained infections, stopped bleeding, and occasionally performed successful operations under impossible conditions. Their methods could be crude, painful, and terrifying, but many medieval people survived specifically because somebody was willing to act quickly rather than simply pray nearby. Other times, of course, the treatments probably accelerated the patient's meeting with God considerably. That contradiction is what makes medieval barber surgeons so fascinating. They existed in the uncomfortable space between ignorance and progress. Some of their practices now seem absurd or horrifying. Bloodletting, cauterization, drunken tooth extractions, surgeries performed with poorly cleaned instruments. Yet within the context of their time, these men represented one of the earliest forms of hands-on public healthcare. Messy, loud, partially terrifying healthcare, but healthcare nonetheless. Their legacy also reveals something deeply human about medieval society itself. People continued visiting barbershops despite the risks because hope mattered. Becoming an apprentice to Leonardo da Vinci was probably one of the most exciting and exhausting experiences a young person could have in Renaissance Italy. From the outside, people imagined Leonardo's workshop as a place of pure artistic brilliance. Calm rooms filled with beautiful paintings, elegant sketches, and quiet intellectual conversations between geniuses. In reality, stepping inside his workshop likely felt more like entering the mind of a man attempting to think about every subject in existence simultaneously, and expecting you to keep up. The workshop itself would have been crowded, noisy, and constantly active. Apprentices hurried between tables carrying wooden panels, pigments, tools, parchment, candles, and half-finished projects whose purpose they themselves may not have fully understood. One wall might display delicate portrait sketches, while another held engineering diagrams for bridges, weapons, or flying machines inspired by birds. Nearby sat musical instruments, sculpting materials, gears, ropes, strange models, and notebooks covered in Leonardo's famously dense observations. It was less an art studio and more a controlled intellectual storm. And then there was the smell. Paint oils mixed with wet plaster, wood dust, smoke, glue, sweat, chemicals, and animal products used for pigments or preparation. Apprentices spent enormous amounts of time grinding minerals into powders, mixing paints by hand, preparing canvases, stretching materials, and cleaning tools. Renaissance art sounds glamorous until you realise much of apprenticeship involved manually crushing rocks into colourful dust while trying not to inhale too much of it. Leonardo himself moved through the workshop unpredictably. Some days he focused intensely on a painting. Other days he became distracted by anatomy, engineering, architecture, geometry, or the movement of water. He studied birds, clouds, muscles, facial expressions and shadows with obsessive curiosity. An apprentice might begin the morning helping with portrait sketches and end the evening assisting with designs for military machines or watching Leonardo dissect animal anatomy because he suddenly wanted to better understand how tendons worked. The man's brain simply refused to stay in one century at a time. What made Leonardo especially intimidating was his attention to detail. He observed everything constantly. How people stood, how fabric folded, how light touched skin, how emotions altered facial muscles. Apprentices working under him quickly learned there was no room for laziness. Leonardo demanded careful observation because to him, art was not decoration. It was a way of understanding reality itself, and while learning under such a mind could be inspiring, it also meant accepting one difficult truth very early. Your master was probably the smartest person in every room he entered, including rooms that had not even been invented yet. Although people today imagine apprentices to Leonardo da Vinci spending their days peacefully learning artistic secrets beside a Renaissance genius, the reality was far less romantic. Before you ever touched an important painting, you earned your place through labour, endless labour. A typical apprentice began at the very bottom of the workshop hierarchy. You cleaned floors, organised tools, carried supplies, prepared wooden panels, mixed glues, stretched canvases, and ground pigments into usable paint. Grinding pigments alone could consume hours. Minerals, stones, and other materials had to be crushed carefully into fine powder before being mixed with oils or egg tempera. It was repetitive, exhausting work that probably left many apprentices wondering whether artistic greatness was secretly just 80% manual labour. And honestly, at first it mostly was. Leonardo's workshop depended on teamwork. Large commissions required assistants handling background details, preparing materials, copying sketches, or helping transfer designs onto walls and panels. Apprentices became part of a constantly moving machine where every task mattered. If supplies were misplaced or pigments mixed poorly, entire projects could be delayed. And Leonardo was not exactly famous for calmly accepting delays. Well, unless he himself caused them, which happened constantly. That was one of the strangest things about apprenticing under Leonardo. He was brilliant, but also notoriously distracted. He often jumped between projects, leaving paintings unfinished for months or even years while pursuing entirely different interests. An apprentice might spend weeks helping prepare a major work only to watch Leonardo suddenly abandon it because he became fascinated by anatomy, hydraulics, geometry, or bird flight. Imagine preparing materials for one masterpiece only for your master to disappear into the countryside, studying how water moved around rocks. Again, still, apprentices learned constantly simply by observing him. Leonardo approached art differently from many other Renaissance painters. He did not want figures to look stiff or symbolic. He wanted movement, emotion, realism, and life. He studied muscles beneath skin, facial expressions, shadows, perspective, and natural light obsessively because he believed true art required understanding how the world actually functioned, which meant apprentices had to study everything too. Drawing lessons could become intense. Leonardo demanded observation rather than memorization. He wanted students to examine real faces, real bodies, real landscapes. A careless line or unnatural pose immediately attracted criticism. Working under him required patience because Leonardo himself revised endlessly, adjusting details repeatedly in pursuit of perfection. Perfection, unfortunately, is a difficult employer, and for apprentices, daily life became a mixture of fascination and exhaustion, carrying buckets one moment while accidentally witnessing ideas centuries ahead of their time the next. Perhaps the strangest part of being an apprentice to Leonardo da Vinci was realizing that his mind never truly rested. Most masters focused mainly on their trade. A sculptor sculpted, a painter painted, an architect designed buildings. Leonardo, meanwhile, seemed personally offended by the idea of limiting himself to one subject at a time. To an apprentice, living around him probably felt like standing too close to a storm of ideas. Leonardo observed everything obsessively. During walks through Florence or Milan, he might suddenly stop to study how birds tilted their wings during flight, how horses shifted weight while running, or how sunlight reflected off moving water. Conversations with him could become unpredictable very quickly. One moment he discussed painting techniques. The next he questioned how human muscles controlled expressions, why the sky appeared blue, or whether machines could someday allow humans to fly. Meanwhile, you were still trying to finish carrying paint supplies without spilling them. His notebooks captured this restless curiosity perfectly. Leonardo filled pages with sketches, observations, calculations, inventions, anatomical studies, and random questions about nature. Apprentices sometimes watched him writing rapidly in his famous mirrored handwriting, covering sheets with diagrams of gears, bones, rivers, weapons, bridges, or mechanical devices that looked impossibly advanced for the 15th century. Some ideas were brilliant. Others probably left apprentices quietly wondering whether their master had slept recently. Leonardo constantly experimented. He tested pigments, studied light, dissected bodies, designed machines, and searched for patterns connecting art with science. To him, painting was not separate from anatomy or engineering. Everything connected together. Understanding muscle structure improved portraits. Studying geometry improved perspective. Observing birds inspired flying machines. Water currents revealed principles useful for engineering and art alike. This way of thinking was both inspiring and exhausting for the people around him. Apprentices quickly learned that Leonardo rarely accepted simple explanations. If someone claimed something worked a certain way, he wanted proof. Observation mattered more than tradition. He distrusted blind acceptance and encouraged questioning, which was unusual in a world where many people still relied heavily on ancient authorities and established ideas. At times, Leonardo's curiosity became almost overwhelming. He collected strange objects, studied unusual animals, and reportedly purchased caged birds simply to release them because he admired their freedom. His workshop could suddenly become consumed by entirely new obsessions with little warning. One week, everyone focused on painting. The next week, Leonardo might be sketching human skulls or designing giant war machines for local rulers. And through all of it, apprentices watched closely. Because even when Leonardo seemed distracted or chaotic, there was an unmistakable feeling surrounding him. The unsettling realization that you were standing beside someone whose mind operated far ahead of the age he lived in. Working beside Leonardo da Vinci meant learning very quickly that perfection was not a goal to him. It was an obsession. Leonardo did not simply want paintings to look beautiful. He wanted them to feel alive, to breathe, move, and carry emotion in ways few artists of his time could achieve. Unfortunately for his apprentices, this perfectionism often turned every project into a painfully slow ordeal. Leonardo revised constantly. A hand might be repainted multiple times because the fingers felt slightly stiff. A shadow could be adjusted for days because the light looked unnatural. Facial expressions were studied endlessly because Leonardo believed the smallest movement of the mouth or eyes could completely change the soul of a portrait. Apprentices helping him quickly learned that finished did not mean what normal humans thought it meant. To Leonardo, a painting was only complete when reality itself seemed trapped inside it. And even then, he still might change something. This obsession became especially intense when working on portraits. Leonardo studied how emotions subtly altered the face, how people smiled differently when nervous, proud, amused, or hiding thoughts. Apprentices sometimes watched him observing strangers in markets or gatherings simply to study expressions. He carried those observations back into the workshop, where sketches piled up beside unfinished masterpieces. The process could feel maddening. A normal workshop master might assign assistants clear repetitive tasks and move efficiently from commission to commission. Leonardo, meanwhile, frequently changed his mind midway through projects. He experimented with techniques, tested unusual mixtures, and sometimes abandoned traditional methods entirely because he believed he had discovered something better. This occasionally produced extraordinary results. It also occasionally produced disasters. One famous example was The Last Supper. Leonardo experimented with new painting techniques instead of using the safer traditional fresco method. The result initially looked stunning, but the painting began deteriorating surprisingly quickly afterward. Imagine being an apprentice watching your genius master reinvent artistic technique, while local assistants quietly wondered whether perhaps the older, proven method existed for a reason. Still, even Leonardo's failures became lessons. Apprentices learned perspective, anatomy, light, composition, and realism at levels few other workshops could offer. Leonardo pushed them to observe nature directly rather than merely copying older styles. Fabric had to fold naturally. Muscles had to move realistically. Faces needed emotional depth. Under Leonardo, art stopped feeling decorative and started feeling scientific. That intensity shaped everyone around him, because no matter how exhausting his perfectionism became, apprentices understood something important every time they watched him paint. Leonardo was not trying to imitate the world. He was trying to understand it completely. At some point during your apprenticeship under Leonardo da Vinci, there was a very real chance you would experience a deeply unsettling moment. Realizing your master had become fascinated with dead bodies again, Leonardo's interest in anatomy went far beyond normal artistic study. Most Renaissance artists learned enough about muscles and proportions to improve their paintings. Leonardo, however, approached the human body like a scientist trying to decode a machine designed by God himself. He wanted to understand every tendon, bone, organ, and muscle beneath the skin, which meant apprentices sometimes found themselves assisting in situations they absolutely had not expected when they first dreamed about becoming artists. Leonardo conducted dissections of human corpses whenever he gained access to them, often working in hospitals or private spaces during the night. This was controversial, difficult, and deeply uncomfortable work. Renaissance society did not casually encourage people to dissect bodies for intellectual curiosity, and the smell alone reportedly made the experience horrific. Apprentices helping him likely questioned several life decisions immediately. The rooms where dissections occurred were cold, dimly lit, and filled with the heavy odour of decay. Leonardo carefully cut through muscles and tissues while sketching what he saw with astonishing precision. He studied the spine, the skull, the heart, and the movement of muscles beneath the skin. He wanted to know exactly how the body functioned, so he could reproduce life more accurately in art. To Leonardo, anatomy was not morbid. It was truth. He believed artists who painted bodies without understanding their structure were essentially guessing, and Leonardo hated guessing. He wanted certainty built through direct observation, even when observation required standing over a corpse at midnight while trying not to faint from the smell. The unsettling part was how calm he reportedly remained during all this. While others recoiled from dead bodies, Leonardo examined them with intense focus and curiosity. Apprentices watching him dissect a hand or study facial muscles probably realized they were witnessing a mind operating very differently from most people around them. Fear and disgust seemed secondary to his need to understand, and the knowledge he gained transformed his art. Leonardo's figures appeared more lifelike because he understood exactly how bodies moved beneath skin. Muscles stretched naturally. Hands looked believable. Expressions carried subtle realism because he had studied the actual mechanisms behind them. Art and anatomy became inseparable in his mind. Still, apprenticing under Leonardo meant accepting that your artistic education occasionally involved helping transport corpses, holding candles during dissections, or listening to detailed lectures about tendons while desperately trying not to lose consciousness. Renaissance apprenticeship truly offered a surprisingly broad educational experience. Working under Leonardo da Vinci did not only expose apprentices to art and science, it also introduced them to the dangerous world of Renaissance politics, where wealthy rulers competed constantly for power, prestige, and military advantage. Leonardo depended heavily on powerful patrons for income and protection, which meant apprentices often found themselves working for men capable of funding magnificent art projects one week and starting wars the next. Renaissance Italy was beautiful, wealthy, cultured, and deeply unstable. City-states like Florence, Milan, and Venice constantly maneuvered against one another through alliances, betrayals, assassinations, and warfare. Powerful families such as the Medici used art to display influence and legitimacy. Artists therefore became tied closely to politics because rulers wanted magnificent paintings, sculptures, festivals, and buildings to advertise their greatness. Leonardo understood this perfectly. One of his most important patrons was Ludovico Sforza, ruler of Milan. Leonardo entered his service not only as a painter, but also as an engineer, architect, designer, and organizer of court entertainments. Apprentices working beside Leonardo quickly realized their master's responsibilities stretched far beyond painting portraits. One day they might assist with artwork for a chapel. The next day, Leonardo could suddenly be designing military machines for a duke preparing for war. And yes, some of these designs looked alarmingly destructive. Leonardo sketched cannons, armoured vehicles, giant crossbows, fortifications and military engineering projects intended to impress rulers eager for technological advantage. Whether all these inventions would actually function properly remains debatable, but the sheer imagination behind them stunned contemporaries. Apprentices likely spent long hours copying diagrams and constructing models, while quietly wondering if their artistic education had somehow transformed into advanced weapons development. Renaissance workshops truly believed in career flexibility. Court life itself could feel both glamorous and dangerous. Wealthy patrons expected entertainment, innovation, and loyalty. Banquets, festivals, theatrical performances, and artistic displays surrounded powerful rulers constantly. Leonardo often designed elaborate spectacles featuring moving stage machinery, costumes, music, and visual effects intended to amaze audiences. But behind the elegance lurked constant tension. Patrons could lose power suddenly. Wars erupted. Alliances shifted. A ruler praising your master one year might flee exile or face invasion the next. Apprentices learned quickly that survival in Renaissance Italy required talent, adaptability, and careful political awareness. Leonardo himself handled these worlds surprisingly well. He charmed nobles with intelligence, creativity, and technical skill, while maintaining an almost endless ability to reinvent himself professionally. Painter, engineer, architect, scientist, entertainer. He became whatever powerful patrons needed him to be. And apprentices standing beside him witnessed something remarkable. Art during the Renaissance was not separate from power. It was power. For all the inspiration that came from apprenticing under Leonardo da Vinci, there was also one unavoidable reality every apprentice eventually discovered. Working for a genius could be unbelievably frustrating. Leonardo's mind moved constantly from one fascination to another, which meant projects often advanced in unpredictable ways. He could become intensely obsessed with a painting for days, barely sleeping while refining tiny details, only to suddenly abandon the work because a new idea captured his attention. Apprentices might spend weeks preparing materials for a commission, expecting steady progress, only to watch Leonardo disappear into studies of water movement, geometry, anatomy, or flying birds instead. Imagine helping prepare a massive mural while your master wanders outside because he suddenly wants to study how pigeons land. Again, this unpredictability created real problems. Patrons paying enormous sums expected finished work, not philosophical investigations into the mathematics of shadows. Leonardo became famous not only for brilliance, but also for delays. Many commissions remained unfinished for years. Some were abandoned entirely. Apprentices caught in the middle often had to manage impatient clients, changing instructions, and the uncomfortable realization that genius does not always respect deadlines. Renaissance patrons tended to dislike hearing. The master became distracted by engineering, especially for the 5th time that month. Leonardo also demanded extremely high standards from those around him. Apprentices were expected to observe carefully, think critically, and constantly improve. Lazy work irritated him. Repetitive copying without understanding irritated him. Simplistic thinking irritated him. He wanted apprentices to study nature itself rather than merely imitate older art traditions. This could feel inspiring. It could also feel exhausting. Some apprentices likely admired Leonardo deeply, while simultaneously wanting to scream into the nearest bucket of paint. He challenged conventional methods constantly, experimented with risky techniques, and revised endlessly in pursuit of perfection. Assisting him meant accepting uncertainty as part of daily life. And then there were the unfinished ideas everywhere. Leonardo's workshop overflowed with sketches, inventions, notes, diagrams, and half-completed projects. Mechanical devices sat beside paintings, still awaiting details. Anatomical drawings rested near architectural concepts. Apprentices probably developed survival instincts, just trying not to accidentally damage some revolutionary design buried beneath stacks of parchment. Yet despite the frustration, people stayed, because every apprentice understood something rare was happening around them. Leonardo did not think like ordinary artists or ordinary men. Even his unfinished ideas carried astonishing originality. Watching him work felt like glimpsing possibilities the rest of the world had not yet imagined. That experience changed people permanently, even when Leonardo drove them absolutely insane in the process. And perhaps that was the strange trade-off of serving a genius. Constant frustration mixed with the unsettling realization that you were witnessing history being invented in real time. Eventually, every apprentice to Leonardo da Vinci reached a moment when they realized something important. Even if they left his workshop, they would never think about the world the same way again. Because Leonardo did not merely teach techniques, he changed how people observed reality itself. After years beside him, apprentices no longer looked at ordinary things casually. A bird in flight became a lesson in engineering. A smiling face became a study of muscle movement and emotion. Flowing water revealed mathematical patterns. Light hitting fabric became a problem of geometry and shadow. Leonardo trained the people around him to see connections everywhere, and once you learned to think that way, it became impossible to stop. Many apprentices eventually moved on to establish careers of their own. Some became respected painters, engineers, or craftsmen. Others carried fragments of Leonardo's methods into workshops across Italy and beyond. Even those who never achieved fame still carried the influence of his relentless curiosity into everything they created afterward. Because working beside Leonardo meant living inside a mind constantly searching for deeper understanding. At times, that experience was overwhelming. Apprentices endured exhausting labor, endless revisions, unpredictable projects, sleepless nights, and strange assignments that probably sounded unbelievable when explained to friends outside the workshop. One day you were helping paint delicate fabric folds. The next day you were observing dissected anatomy, or assisting with designs for military machines that looked capable of terrifying entire armies. Normal apprenticeship this was not, but slowly, apprentices absorbed Leonardo's habits. They learned patience from his revisions, observation from his sketches, and intellectual restlessness from his constant questioning. He encouraged them to distrust shallow appearances and study nature directly. To Leonardo, every object contained hidden principles waiting to be discovered. Even a simple leaf deserved careful examination. That mindset separated his workshop from many others during the Renaissance. Some masters trained apprentices mainly to reproduce existing styles efficiently. Leonardo wanted something more difficult. He wanted understanding. He believed true creativity came from studying the world deeply, rather than copying tradition blindly. Ironically, this also meant many apprentices eventually realized they could never fully become Leonardo himself. And honestly, that was probably for the best. The man operated with such unusual intensity that trying to imitate him completely may have driven ordinary people directly into exhaustion or madness. Leonardo's genius depended partly on the very traits that made him difficult: the endless curiosity, perfectionism, distraction, and refusal to stop questioning everything around him. Still, leaving his workshop meant carrying a remarkable memory forever. You had stood beside one of history's greatest minds while he worked, wondered, experimented, and imagined futures centuries ahead of his own time. And after witnessing that, ordinary life probably felt very small indeed. Looking back, being an apprentice to Leonardo da Vinci was probably one of the strangest educational experiences available in Renaissance Europe. It was exhausting, confusing, unpredictable, and occasionally horrifying depending on how close you stood during anatomy studies. Yet for the people who survived it, the experience offered something almost impossible to find anywhere else at the time: the chance to live beside a mind centuries ahead of its world. Leonardo's workshop was never simply about producing paintings. It functioned more like a living laboratory where art, science, engineering, anatomy, architecture, and imagination constantly collided together. Apprentices entered expecting artistic training, and instead found themselves immersed in endless curiosity about nearly every subject humans could study. One week involved portrait sketches, the next involved flying machines, then anatomy, then hydraulics, then military engineering, then suddenly back to painting, because Leonardo had once again become obsessed with how light reflected inside human eyes. It must have been mentally exhausting trying to predict what fascinated him next. And yet, that unpredictability shaped everyone around him. Apprentices learned that knowledge itself had no clear boundaries. Leonardo treated art as science and science as art. To him, beauty came from understanding how things truly worked. Whether muscles beneath skin, water currents through rivers, or the mathematics hidden inside perspective and proportion. This way of thinking quietly anticipated the modern world. Today we separate subjects into categories: art, biology, engineering, physics. Leonardo constantly crossed those boundaries centuries before such interdisciplinary thinking became normal. Apprentices watching him work likely sensed they were witnessing something unusual, even if they could not fully explain it. Of course, serving Leonardo was not glamorous most of the time. Apprentices cleaned endlessly, carried supplies, mixed paints, prepared materials, and endured the chaos created by a perfectionist genius with terrible time management. Many projects remained unfinished. Patrons became frustrated, Leonardo became distracted, and somewhere in the workshop, another apprentice was probably being asked to grind pigments for the 7th consecutive hour while listening to a lecture about bird wings.